How are you, ladies and gentlemen? Not only are we less than 2 weeks away from the start of training camp, crazy that the time has flown by so quickly, but it is also Wednesday, the day where we discuss your Bulls hot takes for the week. So if you're new to the channel, feel free to leave your hot takes below in the comments, and I just might include them in next week's video. So with that said, let's get right into it. So what's going on, everyone? You are listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Our first take comes to us from Jordan. The Bulls struggle early on in the season, but will get it going and finish around with the 4th or 5th seed. So I don't even know if this is really that much of a hot take, because I fully expect that will likely be the case. I mean, as Bulls fans, we obviously don't want to see them struggle to start the season because, again, as Bulls fans, we're probably going to overreact. Say that all the offseason moves were a mistake, that Billy Donovan needs to be fired, and AK wasn't as smart as we thought he was. I mean, really, I can already see the headlines now, hell, even for some of my future videos, but the fact of the matter is, this is a completely overhauled Bulls roster that, despite a lot of talent, are completely new with playing with one another. You have three players who were on the roster at the start of last season that still remain on the Bulls for the start of this season. Zach LaVine, Coby White, and Patrick Williams. And of course, Patrick Williams was just drafted last season. So there's going to be a big learning curve for all of these guys getting used to playing together and getting acclimated to Billy Donovan's system. So yes, it's very possible they start off slow. We've seen that from even a number of super teams that were first put together who started off their season poorly and then picked up midway through the year, where they finally found their stride. The Miami Heat, that big three, when they were first put together in 2010, they got off to a rocky start and then ultimately ended up going to the NBA Finals that season and then winning 2 championships thereafter. So the Bulls starting off slow, in a way, I almost think as Bulls fans, we need to anticipate that. But I do think they will pick it up and figure things out, and I do agree that they will finish with a top 5 seed in the East. Next, we've got Milan M. Bulls will have a top 5 bench in the league next season, bench points per game, efficiency, etc. So I really like this take. I do think it's a bit of a stretch, but I like it because the media has somehow built it up into their minds that the Bulls not only are going to have terrible defense, which I've talked about before in prior videos, but also that they're going to have no depth with their bulk of their offense residing in the starting lineup. And it's not just the media, you have NBA fans in general making these claims as well. But I think this is really short-sighted. I mean, as unbiased as I possibly can be, which is always hard to do, I actually think this roster is rather deep. You look at the bench, you have guys like Caruso and Coby White in the backcourt, a defensive hustler mixed with a high-volume scorer spark off the bench. You've got Troy Brown Jr. and Derrick Jones Jr., great athletes, great defenders. Alize Johnson, who is showing a lot of promise this past season in terms of his ability to crash the boards and actually score at a decent rate when he was playing for the Brooklyn Nets. Then you have Tony Bradley, a 23-year-old backup center that's a solid rim protector and offensive rebounder. And then you have 2 rookies in Ayo Dosunmu and Marko Simonovic, who showed a lot of promise in Summer League. I know I didn't mention some of the non-guaranteed contracts, but this is a solid second unit. I don't know if it's necessarily a top 5 bench in the league, but it's definitely up there, and it's completely misguided to say that this team has no depth outside of the starting lineup. Next, we've got Max Logs. LaVine will make the most 3-pointers in a game next season. So I assume you mean LaVine will set the record for most 3-pointers in a single game, which is currently held by Klay Thompson, which he did against the Bulls. Hate being reminded of that game. Klay holds the record with 14 threes in a single game, which LaVine is actually tied with Steph Curry for second most threes in a game at 13, which he did in that incredible game against the Charlotte Hornets, where the Bulls came back after being down 8 points with less than 40 seconds to go. Now, because we have seen Zach do it before and getting close to that record, it's not out of the realm of possibility for him to hit 15 3-pointers in a game. However, I really don't see this happening, not just because it's incredibly hard to do. I mean, even for Zach in that game against the Hornets, that was a monumental feat. But aside from it just being hard to do, LaVine's level of production on the offensive end is going to change in this upcoming season, now that he has 2 other players who are elite offensive threats that can average over 20 points per game that he is going to be sharing the ball with. He's not going to be putting up as many attempts as we saw last season, and that's a good thing. I mean, LaVine isn't going to be expected to put up the kind of scoring output that we saw last year or in seasons before that, because he actually has other players who can score the basketball on his team on a consistent basis. He's not going to need to be putting up Hail Mary shots to try and keep the team in the ballgame. Not every night, anyway. anyway. I'm sure that there are going to be some cases where that will happen here and there. But the point is, LaVine isn't going to need to put up the volume of attempts we have seen previously, and for that reason, I don't see him setting the record for most threes in a game in this upcoming season. Next, we've got Quentin Velez trading Jimmy Butler for LaVine Dunn in the 7th pick, which ended up being marketing, was the greatest Bulls move the front office made during the Garpax era. So I think I mentioned in the comments on this one to you. I like this take. I don't agree with it, but I like the take. So, when this trade was first made, Bulls fans, including myself, were up in arms that the Bulls, first of all, traded away their best player, their star player, who was still very young at the time and in the peak of his prime, for what appeared to be pretty little in return. But of course, as time went on, the trade actually looked decent because Jimmy quickly became unhappy in Minnesota, and it started to look like Butler was the problem after all, because he had an inflated ego. And of course, the Bulls with Markkanen had a strong rookie season. Both him and Dunn made the Rising Stars game. I think people forget that in that first season with the Bulls, Chris Dunn actually played pretty well. And then you had LaVine, who, we know as today has turned into a star and has gotten better with every passing season. So the trade itself ended up not being that bad, but it can be argued both ways because Jimmy went on to have an even better career and is still even playing at a high level today, even leading the Miami Heat to the finals in the bubble. But was it the best move Garpax made in their tenure? I mean, for all the flaws of Garpax, all the absolutely dumb moves that they made throughout their time, there was one thing that they were decent at, and that was drafting players. Well, sometimes. I would argue drafting Jimmy Butler with the 30th pick was a better move than them actually trading him for what they got in return. They drafted Rose, which maybe wasn't that skillful because he was likely going to be the #1 pick. He was from Chicago. They also got lucky in actually landing the #1 pick that year. They also drafted Joakim Noah with the #9 pick, and they drafted Taj Gibson as a late first rounder, which ended up becoming a very solid pickup for them. So I have to say, I don't think that trade, which could be seen as a good move, at least in hindsight, since Jimmy ultimately wasn't as engaged in Chicago towards the end of his time with the Bulls, but it wasn't their best move during their tenure. Not that they made that many great moves anyway, though. Next, we've got Jeremy Melendez. Ayo will have a breakout season and become a regular part of the rotation in the regular season and through the playoffs. To be honest, the only way I really see this happening is if the Bulls trade Kobe White, which, for the record, I don't want the Bulls to do. I do think that they should keep Kobe for at least one more season to see how he meshes with this roster. Now, of course, we don't know when Kobe will actually be able to play, as he is still currently recovering from a shoulder injury and could potentially be out until December, which could give Ayo an opportunity to show his worth, and he'll likely get some run as a backup 2 guard. But competing for minutes with Caruso and Kobe, and potentially even Javonte Green if he gets some run at the 2, I think that that's going to make it very challenging for him to have a breakout season. So I personally don't think that that's going to happen, at least in his rookie year, just because I don't feel that he's going to get enough minutes to even be able to actually perform at the level one could even obtain to be considered a breakout year. Doesn't mean that I don't think that he can get there eventually, but not in his first season with the level of competition in the Bulls backcourt. Next, we've got San James, or is it San James? Bulls will have 3 players who will finish with 22 points per game: Zach, Vucevic, and DeRozan. The thing is, we know Zach is going to get his. He's without a doubt going to average more than 22 points per game, considering he's averaged over 27 points per game last season. However, as I've said before, I do expect Zach's scoring numbers to dip slightly, just by virtue of the fact that there are 2 other high offensive players on the roster, but he's still going to average at least 25 points per game. I also believe that DeRozan will actually be a bigger scorer for the Bulls than Vucevic will be, even though DeMar actually averaged 20 points per game last season while Vucevic averaged 24. I do think we are going to see Vucevic's scoring output dip a decent amount, given part of the reason for that is his scoring numbers were so high before because he was playing on a very bad Magic team that relied on him for the bulk of their scoring. You even saw that after he was traded to the Bulls. His scoring fell a little as he was now playing alongside another elite scorer in LaVine. Vucevic went from averaging 24.5 points per game with the Magic in 44 games, while only averaging 21.5 points per game in the 26 games that he played after being traded to the Bulls. And as I've said before, I actually think Vucevic's scoring numbers might even fall slightly below 20 points per game, averaging just around 19 or so a game, which is still great, don't get me wrong, but he's not going to have to be relied upon as much for his scoring as he did in the past when he was in Orlando. Not only that, but you also add Lonzo Ball to the team, who put near 15 points per game last season. Kobe White is still going to get his share of scoring on the basketball in this roster, and even Patrick Williams as well. So I have to say that for three guys averaging 66 points per game combined for the season, not only do I think it's not realistic, but I actually don't think it's good for the team either to not be getting other guys involved and having the team become overly reliant on the big three for the bulk of their scoring production. I think all three of them could very well average more than 20 points per game, but 22 points per game for all of them. I think LaVine is really the only surefire one who will average more than that. Next up, we've got Immortal Goofy. Alize Johnson will grow into our backup power forward behind Pat, become beloved by the front office and fans based on his aggressive rebounding hustle and energy. So much so that when his 2-year contract is complete, we re-sign him. Well, if there was one thing we know about Chicago fans, is that we love those underrated hustle players, the guys that do all the little things, the guys that don't necessarily show up in the stat sheet all that well but are huge contributors on the court. I'm talking about guys like Thaddeus Young, Taj Gibson, David Nwaba, Ronnie Brewer, which, by the way, if you missed my interview with Ronnie Brewer, be sure to check that out in my prior videos. We have fondness for these type of players, right? And I certainly think that Alize Johnson could potentially be that guy for the Bulls, but I'm not going to get my hopes up just yet because, again, I've said it before, the guy hasn't spent a ton of time in the NBA and still has a lot of development left to go, but it's very possible, based on the type of hustle player we saw from him on the Nets, that could be the case. It's way too early to say whether or not we would re-sign him after his 2-year contract, but if he can prove to be that type of player that the front office and fans love, is a big piece off the bench for the Bulls, I don't see why we would not re-sign him. Let's do one more, and this one comes to us from the Benny. This year's team is more underrated than the 2010 Bulls. Easy 50+ win team. Well, first of all, I just want to say that it's never easy for a team to win 50+ games in a season, and I will have a future video out on my predictions for the Bulls this season, which will include how many games I think they'll win. But I don't think that they're going to win 50+ games because, as I mentioned before in another take, I do think it'll take the team some time adapting to one another, which will impact their record a bit overall, even though they'll still be a good team and will absolutely finish above 500. Second, I think we forget just how underrated that 2010-11 Bulls team was. So just a refresher, this was of course the season in which the Bulls hired a new coach in Tom Thibodeau. They missed out on the big free agent prizes of LeBron, Wade, and Bosh, and brought in Boozer, and of course it was the year Rose broke out and won himself an MVP, and the Bulls finished with the best record in the league, which no one was expecting to happen that season. I went back and looked at the Bulls preseason power rankings and preseason title odds for that season, and most polls had the Bulls finishing with the 7th or 8th best record in the league, and the Vegas odds gave the Bulls the 5th best odds to win the title at that time, which, don't get me wrong, is still very high. It was higher than any rankings or odds that the Bulls are getting this season anyway, but everyone thought for sure that the Lakers and the Heat were going to run away with everything, followed by the Celtics, the Magic, or the Thunder. So I think people forget that the Bulls finishing that season with 62 wins, Rose walking away with the MVP, was a shock that no one was expecting, and that's what made that team so underrated relative to their expectations to start the season. Yes, the media this year has been ridiculous in ranking the Bulls 19th across the league in their post-free agency rankings and 10th in the East. I mean, I never made a video about that, just how lazy ESPN was in coming out with those rankings and how off-base they were, because I didn't want to draw any more attention to that nonsense than what was already being given. But who knows, I may just have to go and do it when you see teams like the Hornets, the Pacers, and the Knicks ranked ahead of the Bulls in those preseason rankings. But be that as it may, yes, right now the Bulls are not being viewed very highly. A lot of fans and media are sleeping on them, and for that reason, yes, you could very well say that they are actually going to be underrated depending on how they perform. But I think to compare them to the 2010 Bulls, who finished with the best record in the league, and say they are more underrated than that phenomenal team is a stretch. I like the take though. Anyway, guys, I'm going to end it there for this week. I know I rambled on quite a bit in this one. Feel free to leave your hot takes in the comments below if you want to be included in next week's video. If you enjoyed the video, as always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.